One of the single most important reasons that you want to partner with key influencers is because it drives word of mouth. And word of mouth is one of the single easiest ways to get publicity and to acquire new customers. Now, if you're marketing a very expensive product, let's say $100,000 business-to-business software, you can afford some very expensive customer acquisition techniques. So you could pay $100,000 to an account executive to cold call the CEOs of companies to try to get them to buy that software. But when you're dealing with products that maybe are only $100, like a Lacoste polo, it's not very cost effective to do that type of marketing because you have very little margin for error with acquisition. And the second somebody returns the product, or maybe there's a defect or something, you're suddenly not profitable on that purchase. So the key with key influencers is that they help drive word of mouth as an acquisition channel and as a way to get people to buy more of your product. Now, if we look at McKinsey and Company, which is the world's most prestigious management consultancy, they have an article where they analyze word of mouth, and essentially they talk about three key components. Now, I'm going to talk about the three types of word of mouth briefly right now. We're just going to focus on one of them, and later on in the course, I'd like to get back to more details about these and the role that Lacoste plays. So the first is experiential. So experiential is basically somebody uses the product and it deviates from their expectations, hopefully in a good way, so then they talk about it. Oh, this product is way more than I thought, or it lasted 20 years and I thought it would only last a month or something. Consequential is when companies will do things like creative advertising campaigns that are designed to stimulate word of mouth, so it's not just buy our brand, but instead it's more like, oh, we're going to have a silly gorilla in our ad, or we're going to have some ridiculous surprise at the end of the advertisement. So that's kind of like forcing word of mouth through paid advertising. But the one that I'm particularly interested in here in terms of word of mouth and key influencers is intentional word of mouth. And let's just see what McKinsey has to say about this. A less common form of word of mouth is intentional. For example, when marketers use celebrity endorsements, so celebrities are essentially influencers, to trigger positive buzz for product launches. Few companies invest in generating intentional word of mouth. Okay, so that's interesting. This may be an underutilized channel for you, partly because its effects are difficult to measure. Now, this is one thing that you need to think about with brand management, is that often there is a fixation with things that are easy to measure, things where you can quantitatively say, we did this and got this result. But what we see in brand management a lot of the time is that the things that have the biggest impact are also the things that are most difficult to measure. And often those are things that are offline and happening through actual speaking. So that's something you need to think about in brand management, is let's invest in things that are not necessarily easy to measure from an ROI perspective, or just from a pure how do we attribute leads or sales to what we did. All right, so partly because its effects are difficult to measure, and because many marketers are unsure if they can successfully execute intentional word-of-mouth campaigns. So word-of-mouth campaigns based on key influencers is kind of a difficult space to navigate for a lot of marketers because they're used to measuring everything. And what I would recommend is that you set a budget aside to experiment with this. I've done this before, where I've hired a few dozen key influencers to broadcast videos of a brand that I was trying to market, and then I was able to see the impact after that, and it was tremendous. The ROI was far higher than I would have gotten from, or what I had been getting from, things like Google advertisements, which were much easier to measure, but impact was much smaller. Now, the other thing I want to highlight is that the idea of a key influencer is the definition, there's no common definition for what an influencer is. Some people just think of it as people on Instagram that are talking about fashion, bloggers and stuff. For me, an influencer is basically whoever has a lot of influence among the target customers. So that could be the president of association, it could be somebody on Instagram, it could be a blogger, it could be a vlogger, it could be an academic professor. If you're trying to influence lawyers, it could be like a law school dean, something like that. So I have a very broad definition of what an influencer is. Now, if we look at some of McKinsey's data, we see that the way that they're thinking about influencers is not necessarily just sort of these celebrities, but it's also just people that consumers know and trust. So let's talk about what this kind of broad market influencer definition looks like. So what they're saying is that about 8 to 10% of consumers are what we call influentials, whose common factor is trust and competence. So those are the key things there. If you want people to buy your brand, then you want to market through people that have trust and have competence. So for example, with Lacoste being associated with tennis, Novak has a lot of credibility in the tennis space because he's competent in that space. Influentials typically generate 3 times more word-of-mouth messages than non-influentials do. Okay, so this is proving that when you invest in influencers, the payoff is much bigger. And each message has 4 times more impact. So when people hear from an influencer, there's a much bigger impact, recognition, credibility, weight added to that message. Specifically on a recipient's purchasing decision. So if a famous tennis player says, oh, buy this, let's say Nike product, then of course you're going to put more weight on what he says versus some random person you meet on the street or a friend of yours that just does not play tennis at all. About 1% of these people are digital influentials. Okay, so this is something I need to highlight, is that there is a obsession among modern marketers that digital is kind of the only thing that exists, because digital things are easy to measure, but we see that only 1% of these people are actually digital influentials. So a lot of successful brand management does not necessarily rely on digital channels. It's going to rely on things that are happening offline. And often those are just conversations happening at the dinner table, etc. Most notably, bloggers. So when we're just talking specifically about digital influentials, often they're bloggers and they have disproportionate power. So key takeaway here is using key influencers to drive word of mouth, because word of mouth is an extremely, extremely cost-effective way of doing marketing and customer acquisition.